Hello to all my lovely students in 6th grade. How are you today? This is your English teacher Dana from Royal Farouk Academy. Today we are going to answer the questions in students' book and workbook about past passive. So please prepare your books and be ready for our class. So the outcomes of our lesson today: students should be able to revise the past passive, answer the questions on students' book and workbook, page 35, and recognize the sounds of the ending ed. So let's start. Now let's start with your students' book, page 35. Question number 1. Read the magazine article and complete the sentences with the verbs forms from the books. Listen and check. Here we have verbs in past passive. We want to listen to the record to complete these sentences. So please listen carefully and try to answer this question.
Students' Book, page 35. 1. Listen and check.
Here is how the pyramids of Giza were built. They were made from big blocks of rock. First, they had to find ways of taking the big blocks to Giza. Here's how they did it. The blocks were cut from the sides of mountains. Then the blocks were put onto boats and taken to Giza. The blocks were taken off the boats and put onto special sledges. The sledges were pulled by horses and slaves. Archaeologists know how the blocks of rock were brought to Giza, but there is still one big mystery. How were they put on top of each other?
So here we have the steps or the information about how the pyramids were built. كيف الأهرامات انبنت. Okay, let's start with the first step. The blocks what? From the sides of mountains. Excellent. Were cut. Number 2. Then the blocks what? Onto boats and taken to Giza. Excellent. Were put. Number 3. The blocks what? The boats and put into special sledges. Excellent. Were taken off. And the last one, the sledges what? By horses and slaves. Yes, were pulled. So here, my students, look, we have verb to be in the past. This is were because we have a plural nouns in all sentences here. Then we use the verb past participle, verb 3. Now let's move to question number 2. Listen and say the sentences. Let's remember the form of past passive. What is the form? Yes, this is the object was, were, verb, past participle, and complement. Look at the first sentence. The pyramids were built by slaves. In this sentence, we don't know who does the action. The pyramids is a plural noun, then were, this is verb to be. Yes, we use were because here we have a plural. Then the verb past participle built from built by slaves. Number 2, the slaves weren't paid any money. The slaves weren't. This is a negative form of past passive. We add not with were or was. Here we have were because we have plural noun here. So paid is a verb past participle. And the last one is a question. How was it done? The last question, this is depending on your opinion. How did they get the blocks of rock to the top? You can make any sentences from your own ideas. You can start by I think that the blocks maybe were pulled up with rope or something else. Or you can say I don't think that the blocks, and you can use any verb from these verbs. But remember the rule or the form of the rule, okay? Pull, pulled, carry, carried, lift, lifted. Don't forget verb past participle. Now let's move to your workbook, page 35. So please open your book and be ready to answer these questions. Question number 1, complete the sentences with the phrases from the books. Here we have phrases in past passive: weren't, posted, was pulled, were written, wasn't washed. So number 1, these plays were written by Shakespeare in the 17th century. So these plays is a plural noun, so we have were plus verb 3, written. Okay, number 2, let's think about it. This football kit after Saturday's match. Excellent. This is singular. We use was. Was what? Excellent. Wasn't washed. Number 3, this model permit by Lucy and Tim for last week's history project. Yes, was built. Number 4, grandma's cards this year because we had a party for her. Grand's cards weren't posted. Now let's move to question number 2. Complete the dialogue with the past passive of the verbs in brackets. Here we have dialogue between the tourist and the guide. Let's read this dialogue and complete these sentences by using past passive. We want to correct the verbs between brackets into excellent verb past participle. So let's start reading this dialogue. Tourist. These igloos are fantastic. How were they made? Guide. Well, the first thing was to find some hard snow. Blocks of hard snow were cut, and the blocks what on sledges. We have the verb put, and the blocks is a plural noun, so we use excellent verb put. Tourist. And how did the sledges get here? The guide. The sledges with blocks of hard snow. Excellent. The sledges is plural, so we were pulled here by dogs. Tourist. I see. And then guide. The blocks of snow. We have the verb make and plural, so excellent, were made into a spiral shape. And the spiral what? Spiral shape means شكل حلزوني. Yes, excellent, was built higher and higher. The men made that little tunnel as an entrance, and then the last few blocks, yes, were moved into the igloo through the entrance, and entrance meaning المدخل. They what? Were lifted up to form the roof. Finally, the spaces between the blocks, yes, bravo, were filled with snow. Now the last question from this page. Number 3. Why wasn't Mom happy when she arrived home? Look at the pictures and write sentences with the past passive of the verbs from the books. So we want to make sentences according to the pictures and use these verbs: sweep, feed, tidy, and wash. Number 1, the dog wasn't fed. Look, we changed the verb feed into fed verb 3. Number 2, yes. Number 2, this is the floor. The floor was swept or excellent. The floor wasn't swept. Number 3, here we have the dishes. The dishes, excellent, weren't washed. The last one, look at the room. Yes, the room wasn't tidied. Excellent. Look here, when we want to add ed for the verb tidy, we changed the letter Y to I, then we add ed, and this is regular verb. Now, my lovely students, let's move to the phonics lesson. In our phonics lesson, we are going to talk about the end ed. Look at these verbs. All these verbs end in ed. And this ending has 3 sounds as we see here. The sound T, like chased. The sound D, like frightened. And the last sound is ed with the verb shouted. Here we have a note. If the last sound of the ed is a T or a D, pronounce it ed. Look at this verb, shout, shout. This verb ends in the letter T. So, إذا الفعل انتهى letter T or D, we pronounce the ending of this verb اللي هي ed, ed, shouted. Now, let's listen carefully to this dialogue and recognize the sound of ed ending in these verbs.
Student's Book, page 36. 2. Listen and say the dialogue.
How was your holiday, Eldred?
Well, everywhere I went, people shouted and screamed. They chased me all the way home.
Were you frightened?
Frightened? Enid, I was petrified.
With the sound D. Chased, chased with the sound T. Frightened, frightened with the sound D. And petrified with the sound D. Now the last thing in our lesson today. Your workbook, page 36. Listen and say the words. Decided. Look at this verb, decide. This verb ends in D, the letter D, and we said if the verb ends in letter D or letter T, we pronounce the end of this verb ed, decided, painted, decided and painted, jumped, arrived. So the phonics tip: The ed ending sounds like t or a d. We only say it if the last sound before the ed is a t or a d, as we said in painted, decided, and shouted. Now, let's answer question number 4. Change the verbs in the box to the simple past. Say them and write them in the correct sound column. Here we have the verbs. We want to change these verbs to simple past. What do we mean about simple past? Yes, the verbs that end in ed. Okay, these are regular verbs. We want to change them to simple past. Then we want to classify these verbs to the correct sound here. T, D, ed. Cooked, carried, and waited. Agree. Yes, agreed. Need. Bravo. Needed. Try. Tried. With the sound D. Finish. Finished. Shout. Shouted. Excellent. Stop. Stopped. Land. Landed. Missed. Followed. Decided. Liked. Visited. Enjoyed. Fixed. Prepared. So, these are the answers of the question. Here we have the verbs with sound T, here we have the verb with sound D, and here we have the verbs with sound ed. And notice here, if the verb ends by the letter Y, we change Y to I, then we add ed. That's it for today, my students. In the next class, we are going to start with the new grammar of our book. So please be ready for the next class and write the answers in your books.